There's a moment in your childhood you don't remember, a moment lost before words ever formed, before conscious memory took hold, before you had any capacity to understand what was happening, and in that moment, something inside of you died. Carl Jung called this the murder of the true self. And what's truly disturbing is that your parents probably had no idea they were doing it. They thought they were raising you right. They thought they were preparing you for the world. They thought they were protecting you. But what they were really doing, unknowingly, was silencing the most authentic part of who you were. Today, you're going to understand exactly how this happened. You'll uncover the specific mechanisms that Jung identified. You'll recognize the moments when your true self was suffocated. And most importantly, you'll discover that what was killed never truly died. It just went into the shadow and is waiting for you to rescue it. But hold on, because what I'm about to reveal about this process goes far beyond what you imagine. Before I explain how the death of the true self occurs, I need to tell you what Jung discovered about how a child's psyche actually works. Because without understanding this, you won't be able to grasp the magnitude of what was done to you. When a child is born, they enter the world in a state that Jung called mystical participation. This means that the child has no clear separation between themselves and their environment, between themselves and their mother, between the internal and the external. Everything is one. In this state, the child is pure potentiality. They haven't yet developed a rigid ego, haven't built defenses, haven't learned to hide parts of themselves. They are, in Jung's words, the self in its purest form. The self, for Jung, is not the same as the ego. The ego is the conscious part of the personality, the part that says I, the part that identifies with a name, a story, a social role. But the self is much larger. The self is the totality of the psyche. It includes the conscious and the unconscious. It includes the light and the shadow. It includes everything you could possibly be. The child is born connected to this total self. They haven't yet separated the acceptable parts from the unacceptable ones, haven't decided which emotions they can feel and which they must hide, haven't learned to be a reduced version of themselves. And that's where the problem begins, because parents, inevitably, cannot accept the totality of the child's self, not because they're evil, but because they themselves have lost contact with their own self. They themselves were wounded in childhood. They themselves carry a shadow that they don't even recognize, and when the child expresses something that the parents have repressed in themselves, the parents react, sometimes with anger, sometimes with coldness, sometimes with the withdrawal of love, sometimes with punishment, sometimes with something even more subtle, ignoring the child's authentic expression completely, and the child, who is totally dependent on their parents for survival, gets the message. This part of me is not safe. This part of me causes rejection. This part of me could make me lose the love of those I need to live. And in that moment, the child faces what Jung called an impossible choice. On one hand, they can continue to be who they are, can continue expressing their true self. But if they do, they risk losing the love of their parents. And for a child, losing the love of their parents is equivalent to dying, biologically, psychologically, existentially. The child cannot survive without that love. On the other hand, they can hide the part of themselves that causes problems, can repress, can disguise, and can pretend that part doesn't exist. And if they do this, they maintain the love of their parents, maintain safety, maintain survival. It's not a real choice, though, it's a coercion. The child is forced to choose between being who they are and surviving, and no child chooses to die. So, they choose to live, and in order to live, they kill a part of themselves. But wait, because the mechanism is even more sophisticated than that. The child doesn't simply hide the rejected part. They do something more radical. They create a new identity, an identity designed specifically to win the love of their parents, an identity that shows only what is acceptable and hides everything else. Jung called this the persona, the mask, the social role, the version of ourselves that we present to the world. Everyone has a persona. It's normal. It's necessary. You can't show all of your vulnerabilities to everyone, all the time. The persona is a healthy adaptation, but when the persona becomes the only thing you know about yourself, when you identify completely with the mask and forget that there's someone behind it, that's when we have a serious problem. And that's exactly what happens with children who have had their true self murdered. The child begins to believe that they are the persona. They forget that there's a true self behind it. They lose contact with their real emotions, their real desires, their real needs. They become a walking performance, an actor who has forgotten their acting. Let me give you a concrete example, so you understand how this works in practice. Imagine a little girl, maybe 4 years old. She's playing in the backyard when she finds a worm. She's fascinated, picks the worm up in her hands, observes how it moves, feels the strange texture on her skin. She is completely present, completely absorbed, completely in contact with her natural curiosity. The mom looks out the window and sees the scene, and the mom is disgusted by insects. The mom was raised to believe that little girls don't mess with gross bugs. The mom carries a shadow where wild curiosity has been repressed. The mom shrieks, "Put that down, that's disgusting. Drop that thing. Little girls don't do that." The little girl freezes. She feels shame. She feels fear. She feels confusion. What was being an experience of pure discovery has transformed into something wrong, dirty, shameful, and the little girl learns. She learns that her natural curiosity is dangerous, that exploring the world is wrong, that a spontaneous part of her causes rejection. If this happens once, it probably doesn't cause permanent damage, but if it happens repeatedly, in different forms, with different expressions of the true self, the damage accumulates. The little girl learns, piece by piece, which parts of her are acceptable and which are not. And she builds a persona that excludes more and more of her true self. Over time, she forgets that she was curious, forgets that she liked to explore, forgets that she had a spontaneous connection with the world. All of that goes into the shadow, and what remains is a well-behaved, clean, appropriate little girl. A little girl who has gained approval, but who has lost herself. This is the murder of the true self. And it doesn't require physical violence. It doesn't require shouting. It doesn't require obvious abuse. It can happen with a simple look of disapproval, with a change in tone of voice, with an icy silence, with the absence of a response when the child shares something authentic. The most well-intentioned parents in the world do this because they don't know their own true self, because they haven't integrated their own shadow, because they're so identified with their own persona that they think that's what the child needs to learn. But hold on, because I haven't told you the most disturbing part yet. Carl Jung discovered that the part of the self that goes into the shadow doesn't disappear. It remains alive. It remains active. It continues influencing the person. But now, unconsciously, it's as if the true self were locked in a dark basement. It hasn't died. It's down there banging on the walls, trying to be heard, but the person can't hear it, because between them and the basement, there's a thick layer of persona, a layer of defenses, a layer of forgetting, and the self locked in the basement becomes angry, resentful, in pain. It's been abandoned by the person themselves, and this pain manifests in ways the person doesn't understand. Depression for no apparent reason, chronic anxiety, a feeling of emptiness, a feeling of living someone else's life, a feeling that something is missing, but not knowing what. These are the cries of the true self, trying to be heard. And you know what's even more tragic? The person often seeks to fill this void in ways that don't work. Professional success, relationships, money, recognition. They think that if they get enough of these external things, the void will disappear. But the void never disappears. Because the void isn't caused by a lack of external things. The void is caused by disconnection with the true self, and no amount of external success can compensate for that internal loss. Carl Jung saw this in dozens of patients, successful people, admired people, envied people, people who had everything society says we should want, and people completely empty inside because they lost contact with who they really were and were living a life that wasn't theirs. Now I want to show you the specific mechanisms by which parents kill the true self. Because when you recognize these mechanisms, you can start to undo the damage. The first mechanism is emotional invalidation. This happens when the child expresses an emotion and the parents deny or minimize that emotion. You're not angry. You have no reason to cry. Stop the drama. It was nothing. The child is feeling something real. But the parents say that what they're feeling isn't real, or isn't important, or shouldn't be happening. What does the child learn? That their emotions aren't trustworthy, that they can't trust their own internal experience, that there's something wrong with them for feeling what they feel. And they start to repress, start ignoring their own emotions, start building a persona that doesn't feel the wrong things. The second mechanism is conditional love. This happens when the love of the parents is linked to the behavior of the child. I love you when you get good grades. I love you when you behave. I love you when you're how I want you to be. The implicit message is clear. If you're not how I want you to be, Paus, I won't love you. Love isn't given for the child's existence. Love is given for the child's performance. And the child learns that they need to be a certain way to deserve love. They start to mold their personality to gain approval. And every time they mold their personality for others, they move a little further away from their true self. The third mechanism is parental projection. This happens when parents project onto the child parts of themselves that they don't accept. The dad who repressed his sensitivity sees sensitivity in his son and attacks. The mom who repressed her ambition sees ambition in her daughter and sabotages. The child becomes a screen where the parents project their own shadow. And as the child can't distinguish between what's theirs and what's projection from the parents, they start to believe that those parts are really problematic. If the dad attacks every time the son shows sensitivity, the son will learn that sensitivity is dangerous. They'll repress it. They'll build a tough persona, disconnected from emotions, and the sensitivity, which was part of their true self, goes into the shadow. The fourth mechanism is parentification. Now, this happens when the child is forced to assume the role of parent of their own parents, when they need to emotionally take care of the adults instead of being taken care of, when they become the confidant, the counselor, the emotional support. The child has no time or space to develop their own self. They're too busy taking care of others. Their identity forms around being useful, being needed, being the person who takes care. And the true self, which would have its own needs, its own desires, its own dreams, is suffocated. There's no space for it. The child becomes a functional extension of the parents instead of a separate being. The fifth mechanism is emotional neglect. This happens when the parents simply aren't present emotionally. They may be physically there. They may provide food, clothing, shelter, but emotionally, they're absent. The child expresses joy, and there's no response. Expresses sadness, and there's no comfort. Expresses anger, and there's no recognition. It's as if they were screaming in an empty room, and the child learns that their emotions don't matter, that they don't matter, that it's not worth expressing anything because no one is listening. The true self goes into the shadow not because it was attacked, but because it was ignored. And sometimes neglect is even more damaging than attack, because at least the attack is a form of recognition. Neglect is the total denial of existence. These 5 mechanisms rarely appear in isolation. In most dysfunctional families, they combine, overlap, reinforce each other. And the child who has no way to defend themselves, who has no way to get out of that situation, who depends completely on the parents, does the only thing they can do, adapts. They create an increasingly elaborate persona. A persona that knows exactly what to say, how to act, what to feel. A persona that won the love of the parents at the cost of losing themselves. And when this child grows up and becomes an adult, they carry this persona as if it were their real identity. They don't know that there's a true self locked in the shadow. They think the mask is their face, but the true self hasn't given up. It continues sending signals, continues banging on the walls of the basement. And these signals appear in ways that the person doesn't recognize. Strange dreams, unexplained impulses, fascinations with things that don't make sense to your persona. Moments of clarity where you suddenly question, is this life really mine? Carl Jung called these signals messages from the unconscious. And he believed that the most important work of adult life was to follow these signals, to descend into the basement, find the true self that was locked away, and bring it back into the light. He called this process individuation. But hold on, because before we talk about how to rescue your true self, I need to tell you about the price of not doing it. Jung observed something that most people don't want to hear. He saw that people who don't do the work of rescuing their true self end up living a life that isn't theirs. And worse, they end up repeating with their own children exactly what was done to them. This is what Jung called the generational transmission of complexes. The dad whose sensitivity was murdered in childhood can't tolerate sensitivity in his son. The mom whose spontaneity was suffocated can't allow spontaneity in her daughter. Each generation passes on to the next. The same cuts, the same mutilations, the same deaths of the self. And this continues, generation after generation, until someone decides to break the cycle. Let me tell you about a man I met at a conference about Jung. I'll call him David. He was 45 years older when he finally understood what had happened to him. David grew up in a family where emotions didn't exist. His dad was a practical man, side cold, completely disconnected from anything that couldn't be measured or calculated. His mom was submissive, silent, invisible. Nobody yelled in that house. Nobody fought. Nobody cried. It seemed like a functional family. It seemed like a normal family. But David felt an emptiness that he couldn't explain, an emptiness that he carried throughout his adult life, an emptiness that he tried to fill with work, with achievements, with relationships. But nothing worked. At 40 years old, David had everything that society considers success. His own company, big house, fancy car, beautiful wife, 2 kids, and a depression that he hid from everyone. He didn't understand. How could someone who has everything feel so empty? The answer came when he started Jungian therapy, and the therapist asked something that he'd never considered. David, do you remember a moment in your childhood when you expressed a strong emotion and your parents responded? David was silent. He tried to remember and couldn't. He couldn't remember a single moment when he had cried and been comforted. He couldn't remember a moment when he had laughed and his parents had laughed along. He couldn't remember a moment when he had felt anger and his parents had acknowledged that anger. It was as if emotions simply didn't exist in his childhood, and the therapist explained what had happened. David's parents weren't evil. They themselves had been raised in emotionally arid environments. They themselves had learned to repress. They simply didn't know how to deal with emotions, and because they'd never learned. So, when little David showed emotions, they didn't attack. They simply ignored them, changed the subject, pretended it wasn't happening. And little David, who desperately needed connection with his parents, learned the only lesson available. Emotions don't exist. He built a persona completely disconnected from the emotional world, a persona that was practical, rational, functional, a persona that was a copy of his dad, because that's what earned approval in that family, And David's true self, who had emotions, who had needs, who had a rich inner life, was locked in the basement for 40 years. The emptiness that David felt was the true self, banging on the walls. David's therapy lasted 3 years. 3 years to undo 40 years of disconnection. 3 years to learn to feel again. 3 years to bring the true self back from exile. And you know what was the hardest? It wasn't feeling the repressed emotions. It was tolerating the guilt. Because when David started to feel angry at his parents, he felt like a monster. How could he be angry at people who had never lifted a hand to him? People who had provided everything he needed materially. People who thought they were doing their best. The therapist had to explain something that Jung already knew. You can recognize the damage without needing to hate who caused it. You can feel anger for what was done without turning it into revenge. Anger is just an emotion that needs to be felt and integrated. It isn't a sentence of condemnation. David learned to feel anger without guilt, learned to cry without shame, learned to laugh without fear of looking silly. He was, at 45 years old, learning things that he should have learned at 5. But the most important thing was what happened to his children. Before therapy, David was with his children exactly as his dad had been with him. Practical, distant, emotionally invisible. He was transmitting the complex to the next generation without realizing it. After therapy, David was able to do differently. He managed to be present when his children cried. He managed to celebrate when they laughed. He managed to recognize their emotions and validate them. He broke the cycle. And that's what Jung wanted us to understand. The work of rescuing the true self isn't just about us, it's about everyone who comes after us. Each person who does this work. Here's breaking a chain that may be hundreds of years old. Now let me explain how the rescue process works. Because knowing that the true self exists in the shadow is one thing, going to look for it is something completely different. Jung called this process individuation, and he made it clear that it isn't easy, it isn't quick, and it isn't comfortable. The first step is recognition. You need to recognize that the person you think you are, the persona, isn't the totality of who you are. You need to recognize that there is a shadow, that parts of you were repressed, that the true self is waiting. This sounds simple for Nay, but it isn't. Because the persona doesn't want to be questioned. The persona was built to protect, and when you start to question it, it resists. You'll hear internal voices saying things like, "This is nonsense. You're fine the way you are. Why mess with it? You'll look weak. People will judge you." These voices are the persona trying to maintain control, and you need to recognize them as such, not as the truth, but as a defense. The second step is the exploration of the shadow. Once you recognize that there is a shadow, you need to start exploring it. And this means looking at the things you most avoid, the emotions you suppress, the thoughts you deem unacceptable, the desires you hide even from yourself. Carl Jung developed several techniques to address these hidden aspects. One such technique is dream analysis. Dreams are messages from the unconscious. They reveal parts of ourselves lurking in the shadow. Paying attention to your dreams is a powerful way to start acknowledging these hidden aspects. Another technique is active imagination. Find a quiet space, close your eyes, and allow images to arise spontaneously. Don't control them. Don't judge them. Simply observe and engage with these images as if they were real characters. Sound strange? Jung did this every day and considered it one of the most potent tools for self-discovery. But perhaps the most accessible technique is simply paying attention to your exaggerated emotional reactions. When someone does something and you react disproportionately, when a situation throws you off balance more than it should, when you feel intense repulsion towards a particular behavior in someone else, this is a signal. Jung called this projection. We project onto others the parts of ourselves we don't accept. If you have a strong reaction to a trait in another person, it's likely because that trait exists within you as well, hidden in the shadow. Paying attention to these reactions is a way to map your shadow, to understand its contour, its hidden corners. The third step is integration. Knowing your shadow isn't enough. You need to integrate it. You need to bring those repressed parts back into consciousness. You need to make peace with the true self that has been exiled. This means allowing what was forbidden. If you were taught that anger is unacceptable, you need to learn to feel anger in a healthy way. If you were taught that vulnerability is weakness, you need to learn to be vulnerable. If you were taught that your desires don't matter, you need to learn to honor your desires. It's not about becoming the opposite of your persona. It's not about throwing away everything you've built. It's about expanding. It's about including. It's about becoming more complete. Jung used the word wholeness. The goal of individuation isn't perfection. It's wholeness. Being able to access all parts of yourself, the luminous and the shadowy, and consciously choose how to act. The fourth step is maintenance. Individuation isn't a one-time event. It's not something you do once and you're done. It's a continuous process. That lasts a lifetime. The shadow doesn't disappear. The persona isn't destroyed. They continue to exist. But you develop a different relationship with them. A relationship of awareness. Instead of automaticity, you learn to recognize when you're acting from your persona. You learn to recognize when the shadow is influencing you. And you learn to make conscious choices about how to respond. Jung lived to be 85 years old, and he said that even until the end, he was discovering parts of himself he didn't yet know. Individuation has no end. It is a lifelong journey. This channel exists to bring to light psychological truths that transform, to translate the wisdom of Jung into language you can apply to your life now, to be the bridge between you and knowledge that can break generational cycles of suffering. If this video helped you understand something about your own story, if you recognized the mechanisms that killed parts of your true self, there's a way to honor this moment. The super thanks button down there isn't just financial support. It's you saying, I choose consciousness. It's you honoring the work of bringing light to the shadow. When you click that golden heart, you participate in a larger mission of awakening. You are not just a spectator. You are someone who is doing the most important work there is, knowing yourself. Be part of those who choose to break the cycle, instead of repeating it, together. We are bringing consciousness to wounds that pass from generation to generation. Now I want to leave you with something practical, something you can do today, to begin the process of rescuing your true self, tonight, before you sleep. Grab a piece of paper and a pen and answer this question. What did I want to be when I was a child, before I learned what was acceptable to want? Don't overthink it. Don't judge. Just write what comes to mind. It might be a profession your parents ridiculed. It might be a way of being that was forbidden. It might be a dream you buried so deep you almost forgot it existed. Write it down and then read what you wrote. You'll probably feel something. It might be sadness for what was lost. It might be anger for what was taken. It might be joy for rediscovering something you thought was dead. Whatever it is, allow it. That emotion is the true self sending a signal. It's the beginning of reconnection. Jung once said that unlived life is a disease of which one can die. He was talking about the true self. He was talking about all the possibilities that were suffocated, of all the versions of ourselves that could never exist. The good news is that it's never too late. The true self hasn't died, and it's just waiting. And every time you choose consciousness instead of automaticity, every time you allow an emotion that was forbidden, every time you question the persona you've built, you're opening the basement door. The true self is ready to come out. The question is, are you ready to receive it? Write in the comments, true self, if you recognize something of your own story in this video. If you identified moments when parts of you were murdered, if you felt the call to begin the rescue work, and if you're already on this journey, tell us how it's going. Your experience can help others who are beginning to understand that the person they thought they were wasn't the totality of who they are. We'll see you in the next video. And remember, the true self never died. It just went into the shadow, and the shadow can be illuminated.